In World War II, we knew what was happening. The Nazis were taking people away, and many of them were being killed. Some of those victims and their families saw it coming, and they came to the United States and asked for refuge. They were turned away. There was a vote on the floor of the United States Senate. Senator Bob Wagner of New York proposed that the United States accept 10,000 Jewish children as refugees in the United States. His amendment was defeated. By the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt had second thoughts and began receiving Jewish refugees, but the Holocaust had raged through Europe before that decision was made. After World War II, we decided as a nation to make amends for a terrible judgment that we made during that war. We set out to establish a standard for the world in terms of accepting refugees. It was a standard that was sustained by presidents of both political parties, and we only have to look to the population of the United States to see evidence of what it meant. What it meant to Cubans who came to the United States, and incidentally, several of those Cuban Americans are serving as United States senators today. What it meant to the Vietnamese who came to the United States after the end of that war. What it meant to Soviet Jews, Somalians, and so many others in the course of history. We said to the world, we're going to open our doors, not to everyone. We're going to check who you are before you come in. But we're going to let you know that America is a different nation than it was back during World War II. The Trump administration is admitting the fewest refugees to the United States since World War II, despite the fact that we face the worst refugee crisis in the history of the world. And we face reality. The reality is there's not a single member of this panel or anyone in this room who is going to defend MS-13 or gang activities, period. But does anyone really believe that one of our most pressing security issues in the United States today would be children fleeing horrific violence in Central America? So far this year, 15,000 unaccompanied children have been apprehended at our southwest border. This is far from a crisis in a nation of 325 million people. Look at what we expect from our friends and allies in the Middle East. Countries with smaller populations and more economic uncertainty than the United States. We expect them to absorb tens of thousands of refugees in the Middle East. The real crisis, we know, is in the Northern Triangle of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. There we have the highest homicide rates in the world, and young women and girls face a constant threat of sexual violence with little protection from local police. That's why children and their families are literally risking their lives to flee to our border. If people were migrating because of legal loopholes, we would be seeing them coming from all over Central and South America. Instead, more than 90% of unaccompanied children referred to the Health and Human Services Agency are from the three nations of the Northern Triangle. And the Trump administration refuses to address the root causes that are driving this migration to the United States. They're making it worse. The administration's budget request for the region would slash our assistance by 1/3. And the administration has terminated the temporary protected status for El Salvador and Honduras, forcing more than 250,000 people presently in the United States back to the Northern Triangle, only fueling more instability in the region. Last year, the administration ended the Central American Minor Program, which permitted children from the Northern Triangle to apply for refugee settlement from their home country. What does that do? It creates a desperate situation, driving more children to make the dangerous journey north. Unfortunately, we asked, but the majority of the subcommittee denied our request to have someone from the State Department on this panel so we could hear their assessment of conditions in the Northern Triangle. Now, for years, the Republicans in Congress blamed the Obama administration for these problems. Now that the problems continue under President Trump, they found a new target. What President Trump calls, and I quote, bad laws the Democrats gave us. But the law the president's referring to, and the focus of today's hearing, is one that my colleague from California knows full well. It's the bipartisan Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, which passed by unanimous consent in the Senate and was signed into law by Republican President George W. Bush. That law ensures the United States meets its international obligations to unaccompanied children. It was a response to bipartisan concerns that children apprehended by our Border Patrol were being returned to countries and facing persecution and death. Under TVPRA, unaccompanied children from the Northern Triangle are transferred to HHS and placed in deportation proceedings. It gives them a chance to make their case before a judge. The Trump administration would like to treat those children like those coming from Mexico, meaning they'd be screened at the border by a Border Patrol agent and returned to their home without ever going through an adjudication. Consider Samuel and Emily, siblings, aged 3 and 6 from Honduras. When they arrived in the United States, they were traumatized and would not speak. After months of counseling, Emily revealed that both children had been raped by drug cartel members. Without TVPRA protection, Samuel and Emily would have been returned to Honduras at almost certain further exploitation. Now, the administration says this law is being exploited by gangs, but unaccompanied children undergo multiple screenings and background checks, and the law gives the government the authority to place any unaccompanied child in a secure facility if they even suspect a threat. Since 2012, the Department of Homeland Security, in 7 years, has apprehended 167 unaccompanied children. 7 years, 167, with confirmed or suspected gang affiliation. Hardly an overwhelming number that suggests changing the law is justified. And it's important to take allegations of gang affiliation with some degree of at least questioning, if not skepticism. Consider the case of Daniel Ramirez. Last year, ICE stripped this young man of his DACA status and tried to deport him. I contacted ICE, and I was told Mr. Ramirez was a gang member, and that's the way it was going to be, Senator. But earlier this month, a federal judge appointed by President Bush, incidentally, rejected this claim, saying, quote, there was no evidence that Mr. Ramirez was affiliated with a gang. This case shows the danger of legislation such as we've heard before, the Criminal Alien Gang Member Removal Act, which would grant DHS sweeping authority to deport an immigrant if it claimed a, quote, reason to believe, close quote, he is affiliated with a gang, even if that person has never been accused of a crime. Instead, we should focus on preventing unaccompanied children from being recruited by gangs. Unfortunately, the Trump administration is slashing funding for ORR, which will undermine its gang prevention efforts. I'm going to conclude by saying I stand ready to work on a bipartisan basis with anyone who's genuinely interested in combating gang recruitment. But I will never stop fighting against those intent on gutting humanitarian protections for children who are fleeing persecution or suggesting that the policy of the United States should now be to separate children from their parents.